so my sophomore year of high school, there was a friend group of about 5 of us, and one of the first ones to get a job was my friend Joey. He was the first one to get a job. He'd been a very good friend since the first grade, lived across the alley from me, was just a really gracious, kind kid, and he got a job at the local Chinese restaurant. It was called the Happy Diner, and of course his job was to be dishwasher, and I have no doubt that he was a really, really good employee, and all of that became more clear when a few months later, I remember him showing up at school going, "Hey, I got promoted." And I later learned that his promotion was to chief onion slicer. He would get a giant box of onions and other vegetables, and his job was just to slice them. But that meant that they were hiring a new dishwasher. So he suggested to the crew of us that we should apply, and one guy had already got another job at a grocery store, and a couple guys didn't want to get jobs, and I didn't really want to get a job, but I was like, I think I could wash dishes. So I applied, and thanks to Joey's recommendation, got the gig, and that's when I got my introduction into commercial dishwashing, which it's a problem when I don't know that I'd ever washed a dish in my life up until that point. So I remember showing up, and a couple things that were really unexpected to me. First of all was cleaning the grease traps at the end of the day, but that's a different story. Really what stood out to me was they had a pretty strong lunch business. I think they had a buffet over lunch, but they didn't have a dishwasher over lunch. And so in this case, me or whatever high school kid they had washing dishes that night would show up at 4 o'clock, and there'd be this mountain of dishes already there. And so the idea was you catch up from the lunch dishes, and then you make sure the dinner dishes are done, and then you clean the grease traps and you go home. But one of the weird nuances of that was, of course, when you take sweet and sour sauce, I didn't know this at the time, but when you take sweet and sour sauce and spread it thinly across a plate, and then you let it dry for 3 hours, it's like a lacquer that I think they could use to install the insulation on the space shuttle. I mean, this stuff was hard as a rock. And so you showed up to these dishes that were already soiled and everything had dried, and we all know how that is at our home in the first place, let alone sweet and sour sauce. And then you would load it up in this tray, but it was hard to wash them because the other thing that I learned was that their sprayer, maybe you've used one or you can picture it like the commercial sprayer, it only had cold water. I'm not kidding. I have no idea how they passed health inspection because there was no hot water available to the dishwasher except for the dishwasher itself. And the way that water got hot was if it cycled enough times, then it became hot. And so what we'd had to do when we'd show up, or when I would show up, is you'd load up this thing, and you'd shove it in the dishwasher, close the lid thing, and then let it cycle, and then you'd open it, and the first time you'd have to do that 3 or 4 times to get some hot water flowing, and then you'd roll it back out, and you'd spray it with cold water, and you'd kind of scrub a little bit, and then you'd shove it back in there. And so even when you had hot water going in the dishwasher, it was 2 or 3 cycles, and then even still, I remember you'd be putting dishes away, and it'd be like taking your apron and wiping off the rice. So it wasn't all that enjoyable. The other hilarious thing is, and I remember even at the time it was hilarious, is I don't know why this was decided this way, but whenever someone ordered wontons, it was the dishwasher's job to prepare the wontons. So the waitress would walk in and go, "Wontons," and it was my job to walk across the kitchen into the cooler and grab these wontons and throw them in this hot water and then stand there for a minute, soapy hands and all, and then my job to go give them the wontons. So about 30 seconds in, I hated my life. And about the 3rd day in, I had what I thought was a good idea, also as a reflection that I wasn't a very healthy kid at the time. My idea was this, because the other bonus to the job was I got unlimited access to the Coke machine, which is always kind of a dangerous thing when you give a 16-year-old unlimited access to Coca-Cola. And you may remember at the time, those of you who grew up in the 90s, the beverage carrier of choice, it wasn't a Yeti or those $400 bottles that we have now. It wasn't even an Nalgene. It was a sports cup with like a plastic lid and then a corrugated straw that and you could play this song with it. And the straw doubled as a conduit to go underneath a street. It was gigantic, and the cup held like 400 gallons of soda, and the straw allowed you to drink them in about 20 seconds. And so what I started doing was bringing that to work with me, but I'd fill about the bottom 2 inches with, this is terrible, I should not be telling this story, well, here we go. I'd fill the bottom 2 inches of it with Jack Daniels. And the idea was that I'd just kind of keep diluting that over the course of the day, and I would numb the pain of the job and have Jack and Coke while I was washing dishes. And as best I could tell, I had everybody fooled, although I should have realized I didn't, because I think it was the first time I did it, because I wasn't there very long. I was I was going across the dishwashing area, and next to that was this kind of area that was still back office. It's where my friend Joey was cutting onions and crying continuously, and this is where the soda machine was. So customers didn't go there, but waiters and waitresses and that type of thing did. And I was walking into there, and I was going to fill up my cup, and so I had the lid in one hand and the cup in the other, and at some point I hit some water, and it's like something out of a movie. I slipped, and then of course you do that with the cup, and I watched this blob of soda fly through the air right towards the soda machine, and as luck would have it, the boss's wife, she was also a Chinese American, and in hindsight, they were these great people, but she was crouched down beneath the soda machine, underneath the cupboard, getting glasses, and so I watched in what it felt like it took 4 hours to get to her, as this soda landed between her shoulder blades. She happened to be wearing a white blouse. At the time, I remember apologizing and think all is okay. In hindsight, I'm like, at some point, they realized that wasn't soda on their back. I figured it all out, that they had figured it out when the next day I showed up for work, and the boss met me at the front door, wouldn't even let me in the place. And all I remember is he had this very stern look on his face, and he was holding a white envelope, and it was something like this. And I said, "What is that?" And he said, "It's your paycheck." And I said, "It's not payday. We get paid on Fridays." And he said, "For you, it's payday." And then he began to explain that I was fired. Not necessarily proud, though there is this, and this is kind of where I want to delve in. You learn a lot from getting fired, right? Ever been fired? Or ever, maybe not a literal firing, ever had a parting of ways? Or ever had a breakup? Of course, you probably have, whether that was a formal divorce or a high school sweetheart or just a long relationship. Or how about a family feud? Maybe you're in one now where it's just been extended time and there's this, and you don't even know why you're mad at each other anymore. Maybe you left a church or some kind of organization or company that you poured your heart and soul into. Like breakups, much like strikeouts, much like failure, one of the things that they do, much like getting fired, and I'm proud to say at least to this point in my life, it's the only time I've been fired, they have a way of forcing us to look in the mirror and begin to go, wait a minute, what was mine in all of that? And so here's what I want to do this morning is we started this conversation in the Scratch Gravels last weekend where we asked this question, what if this is a little bit like exile? Like what if what we're experiencing and the loss of routine and the disorientation and the disruption and the cards in the air and the sense that life may never be the same again, what if that's not unprecedented emotion for the human experience? What if it's a little bit like exile? And when I say exile, I'm referring then to a group of people that we find in the Bible that we often refer to as the Israelites, who in 587 or 586, there's debate around the exact year. I was very distracted watching myself last weekend, and I kept saying 586, knowing my professors, or 587, knowing my professors would say 586, but it's one of those dates. All the same, what happened is in 586 or 587, King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, finally showed up and just flattened Jerusalem. And for centuries there had been conflict, but in this case he finally put a siege around the city and eventually flattened the walls, flattened the temple, flattened the palaces, killed a lot of the people, chased a lot of them into the woods, gouged out the king's eyes, and brought them back to the city of Babylon, to the capital of Babylonia. And ultimately, those people, those Jewish people, they're what we refer to as exiles. And what exile means, among other things, is these people who everything about what they knew was gone. Language, gone. Religion, gone. Government, gone. Their way of living, gone. It was all gone. And thus the question that we're asking is, what if what we're experiencing is a little bit like exile? And I think the advantage of asking the question is it allows us to say, what can we learn from them? And I don't know what your view of the Bible is, and frankly, it's not important to me that we all have the same nuanced views. My view is this, that it's filled with stories of real people who had real experiences, who had real struggle and real joy, real temptation and real hardship, and ultimately, their problems weren't that much different than ours. Nor were there opportunities. Despite the, at times, thousands of years of separation, despite the fact that they're on a different continent in different kinds of economies, despite the fact that their lives were so different, in many ways they weren't different. And if you believe like I believe, and many people believe, that not only that, but that that group of people was uniquely being used by God in a story about turning the world back to rights, in a story not about rescuing people from, not about sucking souls off the earth, but about restoring God's creation project, a project that culminated on Easter, the first day of new creation. If you believe that, then what we get to do when we look at the text is take moments like this and learn from them. And not just learn from them from the human perspective, but learn what they learned about God, or at least what they understood they learned about God, and what God was doing in that season. It's a little bit like, have you noticed that like when life's not working, you turn to somebody for whom it is working? I mean, and this can be trivial. I mean, even for you do-it-yourselfers. If at some point you can't figure out the plumbing, ideally you call a plumber, or at least somebody who knows more about it than you do. A couple summers ago, we were driving across the pass at Butte, and it didn't take a genius to see that there was problems with our car because there was steam coming up everywhere, and I pulled over and I popped the hood, and I'm not a mechanic, but I'm not a complete noob at motors, and I knew like, okay, antifreeze gone, and I probed where I knew to probe, and I couldn't find any blown hoses or anything, so I picked up the phone and I called my friend Steve. Why? Because I know that he knows more about this stuff than I do, and much more, and that he would be helpful. We see this is what therapy, this is what counseling's all about. This is why we're so reliant upon our educators, is when life doesn't make sense, we need people for whom it does make sense. To me, that's what we get to do with the text. One of my heroes, and if you've been around at all, you've heard me reference him often, but like the type of hero that I've never got to meet was a guy named Dallas Willard, and I say past tense because a handful of years ago, he went from popular author and theological thinker and conference speaker to, frankly, I kind of missed the interlude. Next thing I knew, he was gone. He had died. It turns out he'd been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and in a span of just about a year, he went from all those things to dead. But shortly after he died, John Ortberg, this brilliant leader and communicator, pastor of a church in Menlo Park, California, he published a book called Soul Keeping. And Soul Keeping was, among other things, a story of John's friendship with Dallas. He knew him better than most. And ultimately, it was a story about Dallas's final year. So here you have this book that's recounting this great theological thinker. Some would place him next to C.S. Lewis in our own lifetime, but also insight. I suppose much like The Great Divorce for C.S. Lewis, or rather the one of, I forget the name of it now, but you've got this book, A Grief Observed. That's the C.S. Lewis book I was trying to think of. As he was grieving his wife's death, you get this great insight from C.S. Lewis, and from John Ortberg, you get this incredible insight into what Dallas was thinking and what he was experiencing in the final years of his life. So I've read the book, and in my head, I've earmarked it. Like, it's what I'm picking up when I get the diagnosis, or my wife gets the diagnosis, or something like cancer becomes that near and dear to me. Why? Because when life doesn't make sense, we go looking for people for whom it does make sense. Here's where I think Exile comes in. These people, much like you and I, and again, you have to put yourself in their shoes. When they first ended up in Babylon, they didn't know for how long. They didn't know to what extent and for how long life was going to be different. And they began to wrestle with these hard questions. And one of the first things they did was they started to understand it as they'd been sent to their room. My friend Jack Oberweiser said yesterday, I thought very brilliantly, he said, we've all been sent to our room, and when you get sent to your room, or when you send your kids to your room, the intent is what? It's to force reflection, accountability. I used to work for a guy. When I first worked for him, it was the most foreign thought to me. He would pray for high school kids. He was a brilliant youth pastor, and I was an intern, and he would pray for them to get caught. And I remember going, well, that's not kind. But his point was getting caught is grace. Getting caught is a chance to look who we're becoming in the eye and assess whether or not that's what we want to become. And that's what Israel did. So here's the backstory. About 150 years before exile, there's a guy named Isaiah. One of the most popular Old Testament books is the book of Isaiah. And in the early part of the book, we have a prophet named Isaiah, and he's speaking. Let me give a little bit of geopolitical context, and you might fall asleep and someone can elbow you when you wake up. But I think this is valuable and important to know. Isaiah is speaking in the 700s in a time when there was two kingdoms of Israel, so to speak. See, we all know the one started under David, and then there was conflict, and it became two shortly after David. And the two involved 11 tribes, the northern tribes. We often refer to them as Israel, starting their own country. And the unique thing about Israel, and part of what added to the dynamic there, was Israel had all the wealth. The northern kingdoms, they had the land. It was the rural part of the country. They had the natural resources. They didn't have the universities and the sophisticated religion. They had the wealth. And then you had one tribe, the southern kingdom, Judah. They didn't have anything. They had the wilderness. Or rather, what they had weren't natural resources. They had the capital, which means they had the king and the palace and the temple and all the authority that came with that. And so you had these two kingdoms. Well, when Isaiah's doing his work, again, 100 or so years before all of this, what's going on is there's a Neo-Assyrian revival. The Assyrian Empire is once again rising to the surface, and they want to become a world power in this area. Prior to that, they were weak, and there were all these little separate countries, but they were threatening to expand all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. That put Israel to the north, and to a lesser extent, Judah to the south, in danger. So Israel was freaking out. So Israel united with another little tiny country named Aram, and they formed an alliance. Think modern-day warfare. And the idea was that they wanted Judah, the southern kingdom, to join with them so that when Assyria ended up in their part of the woods, they could put up a fight. But the southern kingdom, being influenced by Isaiah, was being told, God doesn't want you to unite. There's all kinds of different things religiously and sociopolitically that contribute to why, but ultimately Isaiah kept saying, don't do it. It's much like Jesus when he kept saying, listen, you don't want to go toe-to-toe in a fight with Rome. It's not the way. Isaiah was saying, don't do it. Don't unite with them. And so they were reticent to do so. But then that left Israel and Aram threatened, and so they began threatening to go to war against Judah in order to overthrow the king, in order to replace him with a king that would be sympathetic to their endeavors. Crazy how politics don't really change, isn't it? That's the context of the early chapters of Isaiah. And there's a point where Isaiah says to these people, he says, or God says to Isaiah, and Isaiah says to these people, hey, God says to Isaiah, ask for a sign. Just ask for a sign not to do this. It'll be okay if you don't unite with them. And Isaiah's like, I'd never ask you for a sign. There's this kind of mixed message there. And ultimately God says, okay, I'll give you a sign. And you may recognize this because we often associate it with Christmas for good reason, but here's ultimately then what God did. Therefore, chapter 7, verse 14, the Lord himself will give you a sign. And this might freak you out, but watch this. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. Now the gospel writer Matthew uses this verse to make sense of Jesus' birth. And in fact, there's lots of parallels with Isaiah's message. But what does it mean then? What's going on here? It's more or less this. God saying to the people through Isaiah, hey, listen, you know that girl who's about 12 years old, not long from getting married, like not even married yet, still a virgin? Here's the deal. In no time, what's going to feel like no time, she's going to get married, which means she's going to get pregnant, which means she's going to have a baby. And in about the amount of time that's going to take, in about the next year or two at most, you're going to look up and you're going to go, whoa, God was with us. See, Isaiah is saying to them, take a breath. Don't succumb to the pressure. Don't unite with the north. Trust what I'm directing you to do. And I know it feels like it's going to be forever right now, but I'm telling you, and the amount of time it takes for a 12-year-old girl to become a wife and a mother is about how long you're going to have to wait. Now, the greater story that really arcs from this point all the way through the rest of the Old Testament is Israel, or Judah rather, and their refusal to do that. The story of the prophets in the Old Testament, quickly the northern kingdom fell and the southern kingdom held out for quite some time, but it was the same story. They kept trying to form these foreign alliances in order to protect themselves from kings, and sometimes they united with the kings in order to protect themselves from Egypt. There was this back and forth thing going, and God was in the background going, trust me, trust me, trust me, and they didn't. And that's what led to, ultimately, the breakup. And it's an imperfect metaphor, but it's a God who goes, okay, you're fired. Like, We're gonna send you to your room for a bit. And that brings us to a book called Lamentations. Lamentations, we think, is probably written by a priest or a pastor. Of course, priests would have had a different role in exile without a temple. Probably written by someone like that who's beginning to make sense for the exiles what it is that they've experienced. And listen to just the first 4 verses, though they're lengthy. Here's where we begin to see the insight into how did Israel ultimately understand exile. And that's what we're doing over these coming weeks is, what if this is a little bit like exile? Well, here's part 1 of what we can learn from them, in my view. Here we go. How lonely sits the city that once was full of people. How like a widow she has become, she that was great among the nations. She that was a princess among the provinces has become a vassal. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks among all her lovers. You're going to begin to see these allusions to you tried all these things to protect yourself and you failed to trust God. She has no one to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They've become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile with suffering and hard servitude. She lives now among the nations and finds no resting place. Her pursuers have all overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for no one comes to the festivals. All her gates are desolate. Her priests groan. Her young girls grieve, and her lot is bitter. There's this beginning message of we've got to own what role we played in this. Now, please don't hear me suggesting that what I'm saying is that somehow COVID-19 is God's pronouncement of judgment against us. I'm frankly not interested in that speculation. It's an imperfect metaphor to that extent. But here's what we do know about what other people have done when life was thrown in the air, when there was complete disorientation. Here's what we know from Israel, is they began to take ownership of what was theirs to the conflict. Verse 19, just one more spot from Lamentations, and then next week we'll look at the next chapter where it pivots from this idea of ownership to something else. I called to my lovers. Again, just notice there's like a little bit of mockery, there's this like callousness to this, some sarcasm. I called to my lovers, but they deceived me. My priests and elders perished in the city while seeking food to revive their strength. There's this idea that we failed to trust God, and that's what got us here. And again, please don't hear me saying that this is a perfect parallel. But what if seasons of exile are a great opportunity, much like a breakup, much like a divorce, much like getting fired, much like a strikeout, much like any kind of failure. We know this is cliche, we learn more from failure. What if we do well to use this time to figure out, okay, what is this exposing? From our own systems, from our own patterns, from our own routines, where is their folly and where is their wisdom? You know, one of the things that I will use for the rest of my life when dealing with any kind of conflict, whether in the workplace or in a marriage, this was really helpful to me recently, where someone just said, just start the conversation. And if I think you could draw a circle in the same way that I'm going to just cut. And let's just say this circle represents the conflict, the problem, the exile, the loss of routine, the fact that the business has failed, the fact that suddenly you're broke, whatever that is. Why don't we start by just going, why don't you just tell me what represents your contribution to the problem? Look at that, it's Pac-Man. But what I love about it is it at least exposes that if a person's just going to pass the scissors back and go, I haven't, then we've got our own set of issues. But I think what we see Israel doing in exile, first and foremost, is going, wait a minute, this exile is a time of extreme ownership. You know, I had my own kind of exile experience, recently. And one of the real telling moments for me was when my friend Dan Bruner, many of you know him, he speaks here once a year, he's this brilliant thinker and professor at Fox. We were talking on the phone once, and he was aware, and he said, Adam, do the work. I was like, what do you mean, do the work? He said, Adam, moments like these have a way of exposing your crap. So do the work. And he knew me so well that, because I think in my head I went, okay, I'll have a quiet time tomorrow. I'll have that figured out. And he said, Adam, it'll take you a year. It's going to take you a year to really do the work, to really dig in, to really make the change, to really own it. What if Exile is a chance to do the work? What if there's something to be gleaned from Israel's experience, imperfect though the parallel is, that it's this chance that we can all, in the slowdown and in the loss of routine, in the disruption, then in a sense we all get to take long looks in the mirror and go, okay, what's being exposed here? You know, I want to be really careful on this one because I think we all know that it's not always the wise who get blessed and it's not always the evil who get cursed, and I think the Bible knows that too. I'm really excited for a Psalm series where we'll see how I think the book of Psalms itself illustrates that. But all the same, I can't help but wonder if part of what this season is doing is exposing folly and celebrating wisdom. And again, if we can just nuance that not everyone who's struggling financially right now was living a life of folly before this. And I think we have to allow that. And some people are thriving financially right now just because they got lucky because of the industry they're in. So I get that. But I also think it's a time where we get to step back and go, wait a minute. Maybe if I'm financially devastated right now, again, maybe that's because I worked in a certain industry. Maybe that's because it was a startup. Maybe that's because I was a new grad. Again, there's nuances. But maybe it's because you were bad at being rich. Maybe it was because you thought you were an owner, not a steward. Maybe it's because we thought we had to live on 110% and our financial priorities were all kind of mixed up. And the opportunity of this isn't, no one's looking to shame you, but it's a chance to own. Okay, so I was on this course that maybe wasn't off by much, but it was off enough that, 1 degree off over a long enough amount of time and can really get you in trouble. I think this can become true relationally. And again, the last thing I want to suggest is that everyone who's struggling relationally, it's a fault of their own. And yet, I can't help but think that if a person was isolated, if a person didn't value community and relationship, if a person wasn't volunteering somewhere in some capacity, reserving some of their time for others, if they weren't doing the sacrifice that community involves, then I would guess that's getting exposed right now. And again, my point isn't to shame or ridicule, but just to go, okay, so maybe this is a chance to rethink your priorities. We did this series called Save Me From My Cell Phone right before this, and man, I'm so grateful for some of the emphasis Cal Newport put into hobbies and the importance of making sure that our life consists of more than a screen. And again, I'm guessing that if a person found themselves without any hobbies or interests outside of their screen, I mean, you've probably watched every episode of Office 400 times by now. Jesus, in what was, to me, undeniably the greatest sermon ever preached, he ended it in a way that could easily be perceived as overly harsh, but I read something from C.S. Lewis this week that says that the cross of Christ confirms for us that God loves the world and that he's with us in our grief and our suffering. So it's not a bony finger thing. It's not a shaming thing. It's not an I told you so thing. It's a I love you so much thing. Jesus says this, everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall because it had been founded on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Listen, I promise this whole series isn't going to be about repentance and groveling and owning this stuff. I think there's more lighthearted things that we'll get into next week. But what if this is a little bit like Exile? What if this is a little bit like a breakup, a little bit like getting fired, a little bit like some of those most difficult moments of our life where we had to acknowledge that we screwed up And again, I'm not suggesting that God is doing this to us, but what if this is a season of opportunity? I've heard incredible stories from families and from business people. What if this is an opportunity to reassess? What if the slowdown gives you a chance to own your stuff? To what one person called, what if this is a season of extreme ownership? Long looks at routine. But what if it's also a season of worship? Like we repent and we own and we make plans to readjust. But it's also a chance, I think, to celebrate a God who is wise, and it oftentimes does lead us well. I think one of the real difficult times of this season is there's this almost survival's guilt sometimes, because you're maybe talking to someone and they're struggling mightily, and you're going, man, there's things outside of my control, but we're just not right now. And with grace and humility, I also wonder if there's not opportunity in this season for worship, to begin to reflect back to God. Boy, Lord, I had no idea how instrumental of a decision that was, but thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, whether that's financial or relational or any other host of things. What if this is a little bit like exile? And exile is brutal, but exile is also a season of opportunity, of ownership, of repentance, and of worship. I'd like to pray for you, and just as you think about all of this and hopefully process this more in whatever context you can. God, my prayer would be that you would guard and protect the way all this is heard, Lord, that I think the last thing myself or anybody from this community wants to begin to say is that you're this spiteful, vengeful God who's using this. It's just not, it's not the stream that we want to splash around in, but yet, God, your history is filled with people and of stories of people who utilize moments like this, sometimes instigated by you and sometimes not, but they utilize moments like this, God, ultimately to take long looks in the mirror, to do the work, to make adjustments, and at the same time to worship a God who does lead, who is an effective shepherd, who does know what he's doing and would love to teach us to build our life on the rock. We love you, Jesus. Amen.
If you would like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook and Instagram.